Almost. Okay, let's just. It's going.
Hey, how are you?
Hello.
Yes, that was fun.
I had a question for you.
Really? For me? What's that?
Have you ever been taking a shower and you were thinking about something that you forgot, like what you had washed? So you're like, did I wash that?
So all the time, actually, and even with brushing my teeth. Because I'll just start thinking about shit, and then I'm like, did I do the top left? Whatever.
Do you not do them, or do you do it over
I usually
again?
don't do it. so, so there might be
I gotta
a whole
get out of here. I
portion-
got stuff to think about.
I gotta go, man. I just... Yeah.
So this is a weekly update.
Yeah, I'm super stoked. We're going to be talking about your new Unraid box. Some really fun shit with Manifold.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, whatever a Manifold is.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, let's see, here's some topics. There's an intern, he made some progress.
Mm-hmm.
Finances is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big part of making this all work. I tried to work on the editor this week, which I haven't touched in a long time.
Okay.
It got me thinking about front-end stuff again, unfortunately. Cool. And then the machine. And the machine
Awesome.
probably should come last because there's so much.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. That sounds awesome.
Oh, I should start a timer. Oh, we have a timer sort of right there.
Oh, perfect. Excellent.
I guess there is chat too. I may or may not be looking at it, but you can look at it and say if someone's talking.
You got it. Done.
I hope I'm not being quiet for this setup.
It looks pretty good.
I guess if you can hear me, all right.
Mm-hmm.
Chat, say hi.
Well, there it was.
All right, what do you want to talk about?
Okay,
first,
so I actually don't even know much about this intern, and what he's been working about. So maybe start with that.
I put out I saw a tweet. Somebody was like, "Hey, looking for an intern position, something programming." I don't even remember. And somebody else retweeted that. And then I replied to them and said, hey, email me. And then I retweeted that so other people could see, and I got a couple of people that were interested in working with me.
Nice.
But then the original person, because I did this right before I went on that travel a couple weeks ago, so I couldn't really set up calls I didn't have a lot of time. But he was very persistent, the original poster. And we did some calls, and he seems pretty bright. He's not even 18 yet. He's in the Ukraine.
Nice.
He has some Python experience. And he was willing to learn Go. So I was like, all right, let's try it.
What an incredible, opportunity and situation we're in. I mean, all I was doing at that time was messing around with NetBus.
When you're 17?
Yeah, screwing with my friends. God, I was a dipshit. Anyways.
Installing Linux, reinstalling Linux.
Yeah, that is so cool, though. That's really awesome. And so what is he focused on? He's focused on some I think bindings for the QTalk stuff, or.
Yeah. So let's see. There is. It's not like an immediately important thing because I got it working enough to be useful. But there's kind of a lot of plans for the QTalk stack. I've been working on that. That's the QMux, and if anybody's seen me working on, what is it? QRPC, QMux, libmux, all of that stuff. Basically part of it though, and then it's kind of a whole ecosystem libmux, or there's a muxing layer to the protocol. Like ultimately, I'm kind of going for kind of like a dbus type system, which is both a combination of like an RPC system, but also this idea of like remote objects. So normally most RPC systems are stateless. It's like, here's some functions, right?
Okay, yeah.
But it's never like, here's an like, it might return the ID to a document or a resource, and then you can do those operations on whatever other REST URLs or whatever, or RPC calls. But in this case, it's sort of like, what if you could instantiate a temporary object, that kind of stuff. Like most APIs are try to be stateless in terms of your session with it. But dbus kind of requires Abby. Hello.
Hey.
And dbus is actually kind of an interesting, like, modern, and I say modern, it's kind of old, but like if you read books on object-oriented programming in the 90s, they had this whole idea of and that evolved into like SOAP and how they thought about it's actually just kind of funny how many like weird, cool, enterprisey ideas were good that kind of pull. Later on, it's sort of like, initially we're like, we reject everything in the enterprise world because it's like, oh, this is over-engineered, it's too complicated. And it's usually what happens is like, it was kind of over-engineered and they picked like bureaucratic technologies like Java and XML. And then people are like, oh, but like JSON and REST is like kind of the same. It's conceptually exactly the same. It's just like more friendly, more like using better technologies or whatever. And so we end up kind of rediscovering enterprise architectures. Like, anyway, one of the ones that has not been kind of rediscovered is how we used to think about object-oriented programming and stuff like OpenDoc. Anyway, dbus is kind of like that because it gives you an API into applications, and then you can programmatically use them, but you're going to have references to stuff in the sessions with them. It's like if you want to work with, an Excel spreadsheet or something, you can sometimes have an explicit reference to a cell and kind of treat it like object-oriented programming, but
Absolutely.
It's remote. It's a really interesting model that there's been criticism of in the past, but I think it's a good model. But you can build that on top of RPC, and then RPC you can build on top of sort of what I figured out is a muxing layer, which is useful for a lot of other stuff and also lets you do stuff like attach other connections in your RPC calls, if that makes sense. So you could be like, oh, give me, use an API that like will provision a new Redis database, right? But instead of like giving you back database information to connect to, it actually returns you with an actual connection object to the database.
Oh, that's amazing.
And you just talk to it like you went out and connected
like an
to
object,
it.
Yeah. Instead of something you have to marshal or serial.
Yeah, or even open a separate connection for. I mean, there's downsides to having it kind of tunnel through the same connection, but there's also upsides. So,
well, the upside to me is that it seems like a new model, new way of doing sort of like net-based communications, a new programming model, different way to think. So
yeah, compared to what people do now.
Yeah, so it kind of is fun to even just try.
Yeah.
Like whether it works or not, like you don't know until you just like run the simulation.
Yeah. The other big part of why even come up with another RPC system is bidirectionality, so that you can actually have both sides make and serve calls. And then that is useful in itself, but then is also useful for callbacks, which is a very key thing to most system architectures that I do for extensibility and programmability. And there is basically no RPC system that supports, no sort of like commonly used RPC system that supports the concept of callbacks.
Interesting. Okay.
Unless you think of like the web as like, oh, that's kind of like RPC, and webhooks is kind of that, but
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's pretty
So
awesome.
what he's working on is kind of the low level stuff. Because I wanted to see, how well he can handle some of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he's never done it before, so I can help him and teach him along the way. But let's see. This week, he is porting. Yeah, the intern. And he is porting an implementation of QMux, which is a protocol that is a subset of SSH that's just the connection multiplexing.
Oh, neat. Oh, okay.
So instead of inventing yet another protocol for multiplexing, which there aren't many of, I decided, if I just take, because SSH is a layer design, and so that layer actually interacts very little with the other stuff. So
Oh,
you could actually
wow.
just
It's always like a composition of features. That's
yeah,
really
SSH
cool.
is a really cool protocol and how it was designed. Like, people don't make protocols like that anymore for some reason, because usually the people that are like inventing new protocols are people like Google, who have like a very specific agenda. But so I just took that layer of SSH and made it a standalone protocol.
Okay.
Just called it QMux.
Cool.
And then in Go, I took an implementation of SSH and took that layer out and made it a standalone thing. And then a lot of what QMux is kind of helpful for is it provides a simple multiplexing mechanism that you can use over any kind of transport, like WebSocket or TCP or anything else, kind of. And it's intentionally as simple as it can be, so that it's easy to port, so that you can have native implementations in different languages. And so I have a native implementation for Node in the browser, and then Go, the original implementation. And so I'm basically saying, hey, why don't you try porting the Node or the JavaScript one, because it uses async await. And it maps pretty cleanly to Python now that they have async await. And so it's a pretty like straightforward port.
Nice.
And so he doesn't even need to really know how to
like what it's doing, really.
Yeah, because the first pass is just like translating these concepts, and it's like, okay, now you have a rough thing. I can look at it and be like, oh yeah, this is wrong. We just fix these things.
Totally.
And then we can run tests against it or whatever. And it's like, whoa, he just ported, he's never, we also did like his first open source contribution in a project leading up to this that was helping him get used to the GitHub workflow and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was really cool. Seeing him work through like first PR. That was neat.
Oh yeah, because you were in chat, huh? There's a Discord if anybody's interested. So yeah, that's he's basically did a first pass, and so we did a review, and we're like, oh, here's some concepts that he didn't figure out what they were mapped to, or he was unsure about things, and so now he's doing another pass. So yeah, there'll be a link eventually somewhere.
So
someone asked.
That's super interesting what you just mentioned about how you originally had this JavaScript library that was used for the web UI. So it might be like a good sort of transition into what you were working on this week for Manifold.
Yeah, so I haven't touched the editor for a while, but that's sort of like a big part of moving forward, because I can't really prototype or explore ideas without the tool. You know,
totally.
It's like one of those things where it's like I tried to do it in a headless way, and I just couldn't get it to like work. I couldn't get a concept that I could reason about that would be the same as if you had the UI.
Absolutely.
So I have to build the UI before I can start, really expanding on like plans for the design of the rest of the stuff. But I'm just constantly frustrated with like how you make front end stuff.
Yeah, that's an understatement. Just
it's like there's plenty of like good technologies, React and like even some of the older school still modern but older school kind of approaches, like what are those other frameworks? I'm trying to remember the names of them there because there's so many.
Well, so you touch on a really interesting problem that seems to be like all throughout software. And I just get your opinion on this. So, like, rather than coming together and assuming we need to design some sort of standards, everyone just kind of like whips off and just creates like a new library that like has a ton of functional overlap with other libraries that already exist, and it starts to really compound the entire ecosystem problem, right? Because then you have like four libraries that do the same thing. Two might be actually usable. But then maybe one is what everyone uses, so you're just like, I guess I'll just use that one, you know?
Yeah.
Instead of establishing
Yeah.
a sort of system for integrating new features in a sane way, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and it might be because the JavaScript world is so good at like kind of trying to break down problems into like smaller problems, because they have this whole like kind of, that's one of the few programming communities where I'll find like micro libraries where it's like, here's a
Totally.
package that's like one function.
It's like 10 lines of code.
Yeah, and it probably has like 3 dependencies at least, It's like, what the fuck? So that's a whole thing, and you can't really like, it's very fun to complain about.
Yeah, I just,
But it is like a thing. It's like, okay, well, what do I want to use? And I figured React for a lot of reasons. And I already told you though, but like I started out with this idea of doing like a Go, kind of like a lightweight React in Go, which is totally doable. Like there's basically, you'd already been able to do that with Go for JS with transpiler to JavaScript. And then that community made Vecti, which is a React-like Go library.
By React-like, can you just give me a quick description? Are you using actual programming primitives, or are you just like constructing a huge string that looks like a React string or something? So
there's a couple of ways to think about it, because like the paradigm of React is components. And so thinking about, and then there's certain assumptions kind of tied with those. So one is like, everything's made up of components, and components it's almost like object-oriented concepts where it's like, it has a public interface, it does whatever. But in this case, most of these components are going to render some HTML and some DOM elements. And then there's a whole like ideas of how it updates, basically how data propagates through the system. And then how that actually renders it, which is not just like blowing away the page, but kind of doing a diff of the elements. And so that's where you get some of the performance stuff. That was part of the reason why something like React didn't exist sooner, was just the performance of it. Like things existed that did it, but like they always came with some, they felt sluggish, you know? So it's felt like a trade-off of like good architecture and like good user experience.
Yeah, and also like a good programmer experience. Like it feels natural to work with React. It doesn't feel like a weird mental model or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe too, React is most people's first experience with kind of like that component or even widget model, but it's the same thing that like, web developed in such a different world than the rest of computing, but like most modern native UI experiences are made with a widget or component kind of model. And it's a little different than how React does it, again, because of the way it evolved in these like situations with the browser and the DOM and stuff like that. But I think it's a good paradigm, and there weren't too many other people like Vue does that, so that's nice. And then others are trying to. There's this idea of web components that sort of captures some of the concept, but web components is so weird. It almost doesn't seem like it's worth it in a way, but it has its uses. Uh,
I was playing around with something recently. This is sort of a side note, but on web components, where I wanted to be able to like load components like dynamically in my page, and I basically was able to get like a component like is in one single file that I could call and then load into my page, and it was neat, but very unlike other things. So you immediately are like, I don't know if because you want to be able to lean on ecosystem support
mm-hmm.
and all this stuff, and so that becomes a key part of what libraries you choose.
um, Flutter is just brought up. Hey, Josh. Flutter is the Google one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they it's a pretty engineered solution that does have the same kind of paradigm, but it's Dart specific, and so it's sort of like it's a commitment to a new programming language.
Wasn't this Flutter initially sold as basically like what React Native solves, like a cross-platform mobile
Yeah, and
device
it more or
solution?
less still is too.
But now they're selling it with this web component to kind of tie it all together.
I think they were I think they had always focused on the web.
Oh, okay.
Because I remember Dart's original use was to Google language. It always seemed so weird. It was a language that they made for doing web stuff, and it felt like it was trying to find a home. Mm-hmm. So now it's like, oh, I guess if anything, the killer app for Dart will be Flutter, but that is assuming that like people use it. Yeah. But they are like you're going to be forced to use it for certain things. Like I think like future Chrome OS and like Fuchsia, I don't know, that operating system, if you heard of, is using Flutter for its UI stuff.
Cool. Neat.
But I don't pick the language that you use is kind of a big deal.
Absolutely.
They recently released for the web. Yeah. So to me it was, I want that component model. Mm-hmm. And React also has kind of the idea of like JSX or something, because a lot of other tools will, and this is a taste or preference thing, but it's like this stuff is living with HTML. So it's like, how do you deal with that HTML?
Yeah.
And so your language has to be able to define it and model it. And I guess kind of the nice thing, depending on who you ask, is to have one is like most web stuff will have a templating system that lets you do mm-hmm. and structure stuff like a web page, like it's actually supposed to ultimately look like, which is why I see a benefit, because it's sort of like the input that you write is at least somewhat like the output, but mm-hmm. maybe that's not important. Mixed in with like custom elements and stuff like components. And then JSX, which allows you to then do those inline with your JavaScript.
Yeah.
Which is, kind of nice, I think. But I'm also fine with like having a template, a separate template file. That's in my Go implementation. That's what I ended up doing, because, or you have the option to do both. You can either use functions actually in a similar way to like Flutter and some others, to say like, oh, here's a div, and you just kind of like nested function calls. It's almost like a DSL.
Got it.
Or you can do templates in my Go version. And the templates are, and that was one thing about Vecti that I added, because Vecti before only let you do render output with function calls. So it was, and Go's not the best thing to have to create like a DSL. It can feel a little, even like Go's not a verbose language, but like certain things you do in it can feel verbose.
Yeah, that's what I immediately started thinking about. Like, do you kind of just use primitives? Because you see like function inside a function inside a function inside a function is the list. It's like weird looking.
let's see if I can pull up an example to Vecti Go. So let's say to do MVC components, let's see, maybe page view. So they, end up doing
that's
this
exactly
sort of
what I was
thing.
thinking it looked like.
And
this
like
is
for little things, this is actually like fine because it's like,
Yeah,
I don't want a
totally.
whole template for like a couple of elements. But
Yeah.
like once you get into composing a lot of stuff, a template feels a little bit easier to work with. So
For sure.
I added support to be able to render React style, almost Vue style templates with Vecti.
Nice.
And so there are all these benefits of having the Go version. Like, it's like then everything's in Go, the back end and the front end.
And
I don't really care about sharing like paradigms or like being able to use the same library, but like sometimes you can, and like
for sure.
that's like such a minor thing ultimately. Like people get excited about things that aren't a big deal sometimes. But like the big one is just like speed and simplicity. Like Vecti has like almost no dependencies and its toolchain is just Go. So like there's no Webpack
Yeah.
or any of its thousands of dependencies.
Yeah.
There's no React and its thousands of dependencies, and the components each have their all their dependencies. The downside is we'd have to create a lot of the components from scratch because there's no like existing ecosystem. But it's relatively easy to go from one similar paradigm in one language to another. So you can kind of look at a React implementation of something and port it to Go pretty straightforward.
For sure.
So maybe, that's a way to think about it as a like work needs to be done, but at least it's like, and this is why I don't like it, because it's busy work. It feels like busy work. But that's something that like maybe an intern or somebody can help out with,
Yeah, for sure. That's really cool.
So I'm leaning towards, after revisiting the editor, which I think maybe, was it running? Oh, it's not running anymore. But that editor I hadn't touched in a while, and I decided to update some stuff because something wasn't working, and just everything was broke. Spent all day trying to like deal with all the things that broke from updating all the dependencies.
Yeah.
And I couldn't even get it to work. Like eventually, obviously, I can get it to work eventually, but it's just like, why?
Yeah,
it just makes you, I'm just thinking like, I wouldn't have to deal with this at all in Go. Like, I would rather be doing the busy work of re-implementing components than like dealing with being frustrated with like
having a sense of uncertainty about your entire system. Yeah, exactly.
So
for sure.
I'm definitely leaning towards now coming back around and doing it all in Go.
That sounds awesome.
Could be.
Well,
because I haven't seen a front end, a like good example. Like it just hasn't been done before. Basically, like anything significant with front end that is written in Go. Let me switch the camera back because who wants to see that?
So that's cool. You got your intern working, finishing up work on the QTalk stack. And then Manifold, you got your working on Golang front end stuff. And then what was the next thing you were working on?
Abby's saying, so the UI would be rendered in the background when you implement it in Go. No, it would basically be, there are some interesting things you can do that's similar to like server-side rendering that React can do, that some of the like, so there's been a movement too of like, oh, well, because you have JavaScript and you can run React on the back end in Node, like you could actually take a front end and render it on the back end and then spit out the output, because then you get all the like SEO benefits or whatever, and like static pages or whatever. But that option is a possibility. With Vecti, you can't right now because of the way it's architected. But I imagine eventually that would be a possibility because that would be nice. But really, it's running Go in as a WebAssembly component in the browser. Alternatively, I could use Go for JS, which then makes it native JavaScript. But I think it's good to sort of get some operational experience and kind of push on the WebAssembly approach. Yeah.
There's actually quite a few projects at my work that are re-implementing things in WebAssembly.
Yeah.
So there is some force behind that.
Yeah. What was the C# one? There's a web framework. Do you know coming out of Microsoft? C# something.
I don't know specifically about that, but there's a few big projects.
Okay.
So that they're implementing it in WebAssembly. So.
Yeah, and WebAssembly is something that's cool because it has, it's basically an interchangeable, executable format. So
you just target it.
Yeah, it's nice to have another option of what's Nancy?
I don't know.
Maybe I said something that sounded like Nancy.
Or Nancy is a library or C#.
Oh, is it? Oh, I see. Yeah, that doesn't sound familiar. But
it's a really cool sort of solution to the problem of the whole ecosystem thing, right?
Yeah, it's a nice option. Like there's a lot of ways to think about like containerizing, or like one of the whole nice things about like virtualization, containerization, they're all about like kind of giving you a better API into that thing, because like most people don't understand a huge value of Docker is having an API to run shit. What is your API to run stuff on a computer? I guess like syscalls or shelling out, right? Or user interaction. Like there isn't a good API that lets you like say, here's a thing I want to run, and I want it to be connected to this, and it's not gonna touch anything else. And so it's just like
and the one nice thing about it that is kind of like surprisingly difficult in Linux is like daemonization. And with Docker, it's just like a -d flag. But if you want to go down to like systemd or like any of those other systems, it's like, oh dang, I have to like write this config file, and like every Linux distro might do it slightly different and all this stuff. So
yeah, it overlaps a lot with init systems and stuff like that, which you can imagine the arguments that have been had, I'm sure.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But in virtualization, and that's kind of the point of the machine too. But I guess before we only have like maybe 10 minutes left.
Oh my gosh, this is burned past. Okay, wow, okay. Yeah.
I mean, the finances stuff is just like I'm trying to get in terms of doing a lot of projects to fund this stuff, or find, revenue to fund this stuff. And as that gets more complicated, my finances get complicated, and the business, and so I'm working with people to sort of like figure out how to like forecast and budget and plan. And I've had my systems for so long, but it's starting to get more complicated where it's not going to scale and stuff's going to fall through the cracks. And that's such an important part of like anything, is just having control over your working capital.
Absolutely, yeah.
And your cash flow and stuff. So that's an in-progress thing. That's maybe why I'm not pushing as hard on stuff. Like I'm not like doing daily working on the editor and stuff yet, is just because I'm still trying to like housekeep, do all this stuff before diving into like deep work.
She asked if we can help her contribute.
Let's see, let us know if we can help. Yeah, well, I will definitely do that as we go along, because that would be nice.
Yeah, still kind of just bootstrapping everything, getting
Yeah.
systems in place. So.
Yeah. So the machine, I guess we can talk about that because that was kind of the big
Sweet.
thing that you were in town for.
Yep. So, like maybe a month
Why don't
ago.
you tell the story?
Yeah, so about a month ago, Jeff came by my place, and I just randomly wanted to show him this machine I'd been building. I like essentially wanted like just a way to have multiple virtual machines and Docker containers on one system. Initially, I tried this operating system called Proxmox. But that was like a humongous pain in the ass, and the mental model for storage was just not quite there. And not to mention, like, I had to actually literally learn like all of the flags to libvirt and stuff to like launch a VM, and that was like a total nightmare. So, I went to the internet and found this awesome thing called Unraid, which has a way better storage model, way simpler. You just think of storage as like one big pool. But then also you get, super simple like workflows to attach GPUs for pass-through and all this stuff, which is like up to this point been kind of hard. Like you would burn away like bunches of weekends of time. So I showed him the system, and he's like, "Dude, you should come over and build one for me." So do we want to try and take the camera and show?
Oh yeah. It's working. We actually put it together and streamed this on Thursday or Friday.
Yep.
Yeah, Unraid's not free. It has a free trial. But also, it's sort of like, I don't know that it's... I feel like, depending on how interesting this ends up being and how frustrated we are with Unraid.
Yeah. There may be a sort of another thing in the future.
But I liked it. Well, first of all, I like the idea. I mean, in the server world, DevOps and stuff, virtualization and creating kind of like hosts dedicated to just running VMs, or hosts dedicated to running Docker is like a very common thing because of the economies of scale that you can get and the having virtualization being something that is sort of on demand, and then you have an API to. Like, I feel like that's something that people don't appreciate about like Docker virtualization. Everything is like, once the thing that you're working in is in software, you can now program it. Like, it's really obvious, but like there's like a tremendous amount of power that I feel like people don't appreciate.
Oh, absolutely.
And VMs, like, kind of dealing with this as Rusty was trying to wrap his head around this, because his experience with virtualization is running like parallels. It's basically like consumer grade virtualization. And they did cool stuff, like whatever that mode was where they can basically render the windows as if they're native things. Like, that was kind of cool. But like the performance was always, because it runs in userland, and also it was 10 years ago, and like a lot of hardware and stuff has evolved in a world made for virtualization, because it's like such a common thing in the industry and in data centers and stuff.
Like
so
VTD with Intel allows you to do that native pass-through.
And so stuff like that is finally being like, well, how can that be used more on the consumer side?
Yep.
Even though you're, one case is to do like a minor or something, and you were doing like deep learning, so it's like you wanted a way to have a lot of graphics cards.
And a lot of different environments, because sometimes someone would have built an implementation, but it was in TensorFlow 1.11 with CUDA 7 and this version, and it was all very specific.
So I mean, and this just happened to be, I saw this after hanging out with some friends where we talk about like, this model of computing that we have is so like primitive. And we're talking about like, maybe we're in like the Iron Age of computers, and like, because of how things have evolved, and the point that we've gotten to, we can go back and like question assumptions and stuff like that. And there's whole like bits of code and architecture in kernels and stuff that we don't use anymore because the hardware doesn't really work that way anymore. The hardware's gotten good enough, um, like like page files and stuff like that. It's like you usually want to turn that off, like swap files and stuff like that. Like that's usually not like an ideal thing to have happen, and you don't really need that anymore because you have so much, in terms of resources and stuff. So there's whole parts of like kernel systems and stuff that you can kind of almost throw away or at least reconsider in a new design. But I liked this idea of Joel and I were talking. When I was talking to you about this, he said he liked this idea. He loves this idea of, as a sort of historian too, like a way so that any programmer, any user of the computer can run any program ever made. Right? That's not possible. Like because of platforms and stuff like that. Although it's increasingly possible as there's more like emulators and really good emulators for old, like Macintosh and like all kinds of obscure stuff. But it would be great. Basically, the idea that I had right before seeing your computer was, wouldn't it be great if there was a computer where you could run any software? Because then you don't have to. You have like. As you're trying to accomplish things in whatever you're using the computer for, you run into these constraints, like it doesn't run on OS 10 or it doesn't run on this version of Windows or whatever. And so it's like being able to have like it can all virtualized, but then also then the trick is having it be performant. And so the whole pass-through thing and the Threadripper with tons of cores, but that makes it like we could have gone through the route of not doing like multiple cores. We could have just tried to like make things smaller, and we've been running into that problem. So we've just been doing parallel more cores, and the benefit to that with virtualization is now you have like chunks of things that you can dedicate to a machine, and so your friends were calling it like your own private cloud. Yeah, it is, because it's taking kind of like a lot of cloud concepts and then making it like something that you can use for your, basically professionals. It's sort of like, why do you need that much power? And it's like, well, sometimes you really need to run a build or whatever. Like, it's just great to be able to be like, here's a little dedicated computer for something, or here's a specialized environment for this kind of work or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, if I didn't have a system like this, I'd have like 3 or 4 computers just sitting next to each other.
Yeah, so and like the overhead of that, and it used to not be complicated because you had KVM switches, and that kind of made the user experience kind of okay.
Yeah.
But like now everything's wireless, and you can still do a KVM switch, but it's like and it's that little bit of that is also harder today. Like. And Andy influenced this too, because you used his stuff as a reference, right?
Oh yeah, and I sort of shockingly remembered like all of it off the top of my head, all the little insights, yeah.
So it's kind of all just fell into place.
Yeah, but this is also kind of like a cool stepping stone to that future of like everything's virtualized. You can run any application.
Yeah.
Right. So that's cool.
So it's sort of like an interesting space that like won't be understood if nobody's exploring it. And I find it interesting, so I can explore it. And it solves an immediate problem, which is the Mac Pro is, not upgradable in terms of like CPU and it's you can only upgrade it so far with memory and stuff like that. Oh yeah, I will show you again. It's right here. It's basically just set up next to me now.
Yeah.
I don't know why that's not getting focus. So I had to rewire everything, and my Mac Pro is over there now too. if you can kind of see it in the dark, but yeah, there's a lot of ideas to explore with this model because we haven't had this.
Yep.
I mean, again, like Docker and everything, you have the ability to do it, but like making it easy is such a significant game changer.
Absolutely.
So we'll see. I was going to use it to basically also like, okay, if I wanted a better machine, but I run Logic, I run stuff that needs to run in OS 10. It just so happens that probably one of the best scenarios to run OS 10 is Hackintosh because it's sort of like relatively standard, it's like basically standardizes a lot of the drivers and stuff, that it's like you have a little bit more control over like getting it to work. So this would let me run OS 10 and get more cores and just more power.
Yeah, you have a power knob.
Yeah, and because the system is a standard open architecture, it's extensible and blah, 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 more so than like a Mac Pro. And with streaming, it ties into the streaming and stuff like that, so. What is the licensing? Like running OS 10, I guess, is the main licensing?
Yeah, I believe that there is like some case and precedent saying that technically in order to like boot it in the VM, you have to do something and break a license or something.
That's people's own choice. I don't, obviously whatever laws and legal stuff, but you do what you got to do to get shit done. And this is not this is one of those laws that it's like, oh, it's just really getting in the way of like normal people doing normal things.
It's such an illusion, because it's like it's not like Apple is a company that is like just really scraping by, like you're not actually inhibiting anything about them economically by doing this. Yeah, so it's like and the fact that their system itself is like built on the backs of other systems work, so it starts to become really, really gray.
Yeah, I mean, they're practically giving away the operating system now. You used to pay for, I mean, I think all the upgrades are free now. Absolutely, and like I don't even know how much it is like, I guess that situation doesn't exist where it's like you get a computer and you have to install it for the first time because it's always on it because it's in. But yeah, that's kind of whatever. I guess I just don't care about, like, I mean, I care about supporting developers and piracy when it's like when it matters.
Yeah, but that is sort of one of those really gray philosophical questions that it's like it's really hard to kind of just answer because I feel like it's something I have to internalize. But yeah, I don't give a shit personally. They're $1 trillion company. Who cares? They got money. And on that note, good night.
I mean, basically, we're all out of time, but we got it working. We built it, and it works. Andy helped out, and
yeah, he definitely fixed a few of the major design flaws.
Yeah. And now it's just a matter of like trying to move stuff over and make sure everything works, which one of the big ones is my audio interface doesn't work. So I can't use it for most things yet. But I can try and get other stuff working.
I don't even know what that emoji means.
I don't know what any of them mean. Like, what could that possibly mean?
Yeah, I just laugh when I see it. Yeah. I'm like, it just looks weird to me.
It's just like it's kind of like people just doing random things. Like if you saw and they just did something random and silly and you're like, I don't know what that was, but that's funny.
It's working.
That's what emojis are, or Twitch ones at least, because they're so like random. Yeah, audio, for some reason, audio interfaces seem to be a difficult thing.
Yeah, with me, the only way I got my audio interface working 100% with no problems was doing pass-through of a USB controller. I couldn't just pass through the device itself. I would always get like a little bits of artifacting in the audio output and input, which is why I didn't send you that recorded file last time. It was like, oh, there's lots of random crap in here. But once Josh, who's in the chat, told me how to do it, it was like eureka. It was amazing.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh. I guess that's it. We wanted to do 40 minutes, but it's 50 now.
I know.
So.
God damn it. It's because that fucking breaking licensing question. Thanks, man. Cool.
Yeah, it's a very different experience from the last update. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Cool, man.
The next one.
Well, thanks.
That's it for the stream. I'm going to work later.
Bye. I love you.
So I'll stream later. Bye, everybody.